Thank you so much for having me join you virtually and giving me the chance to present my program, Women of the Seas and Stars. I call it Adding Pink to the Blue Frontier. And here we go. I just want to start by taking you back in time, a little over 25 years, to July 1995 at Cape Canaveral, where there were thousands of spectators getting ready for the liftoff of the space shuttle. And among those thousands of spectators in the VIP section were 8 women. And within those women, the 8 of us, we were watching, waiting, thinking it should have been us. So today I am portraying Jerrie Cobb, one of, we've come to be known as the Mercury 13 astronauts. And we were on, 8 of us were on that launch pad that day. But before I tell you my story, our story, I want to take you back even further to other women who've turned their sights above and beyond, below the terrestrial Earth. So when you think of us explorers, scientists, aquanauts, and astronauts, you probably think about the men in these pictures: Galileo, Jacques Cousteau, John Glenn, Buzz Aldrin. But there have been women, and what I'd like to do today is tell you about some of them. The first documented woman we know who turned her attention to the stars was Hypatia of Alexandria, who lived around about 1700 years ago in Alexandria, Egypt. And we know about her because a man, Socrates, wrote of her in his books and talked about her fame as a scholar and teacher. And we know that she was able to become a scholar and a teacher because somebody believed that she was capable of education, that her father, who was also a mathematician and astronomer, encouraged her in those fields to learn. And so she ended up becoming very widely renowned and edited part of Ptolemy's book, his Almagest, which was a geocentric and Earth-centric model of the universe. And she also wrote a commentary on the conic sections. But then we have well over 1,000 years, which are well known as the Dark Ages. We don't know too much about either male or female scholars during those days. Finally, in the 17th century, some more start appearing, including Maria Marguerite Kirch, who was in what is now modern-day Germany. She became the first woman to discover a comet in 1702, wrote a number of papers on various astronomical phenomena, and then when her husband dies in 1710, she has the audacity to attempt to assume his place as astronomer and calendar maker at the Royal Academy of Sciences, something that she is supported in by the president of the Academy, who says there's a most learned woman who could pass as a rarity. I do not believe that this woman easily finds her equal in the science in which she excels. But the rest of the Academy rejected her demand. They did not want to start a precedent by appointing a woman. Going halfway around the world, all the way to China, we also learn that Wang Zhengyai was studying the stars, again, supported in education by her family. And after making careful observation, she showed why they moved that way and did so by correcting the calculations that earlier scholars had made. And she also went out on a limb to demonstrate the causes of a lunar eclipse against the prevailing wisdom of the day. Tragically, she only lived to age 29, but her publications posthumously published were quite influential. A woman who was well known in her time, back on this side of the world in the Western Hemisphere, is Caroline Herschel, who is considered one of the greatest astronomers who ever lived. She didn't start out that way. She was considered, she was the youngest of 7 children, considered unmarriageable after being stunted and scarred from smallpox and typhus. Her mother thought she made a very good scullery maid, but she was rescued by her older brother William, who had gone to England to become a musician, a royal musician, and invited her to come over, join him to make some music and keep his house. Well, once she gets over there, she discovers that he's fascinated by stars and quite dissatisfied with the telescopes available during the day. During his day for it. So he sets to making the best telescope around, and she becomes his assistant. It's quite an undertaking. And then, using that new telescope in 1781, William discovers Uranus, the first planet discovered in the modern age since the Greeks. And he is named the king's astronomer, and Caroline becomes his assistant and spends her evenings sweeping the sky. And in 1786, she discovers a comet, which gets known as the Lady's Comet, and it makes her quite famous. 2 years later, William marries and says, well, I don't need you as a housekeeper anymore, but I can keep paying you as my assistant. And she says, I don't want you to pay me as the assistant. I want the king to do that. And she sends a letter to King George, and he agrees, and she becomes the first female professional scientist in the world. And along the way, discovered 14 new nebulae, 2 new galaxies, and 8 comets. And their star catalog is still used today. Meanwhile, we have a woman looking under the sea. Her name is Jean Villepreux Power, and she had been a dressmaker in Paris when she marries, moves to Cyprus, and discovers there's sea all around, and she's fascinated by it. But she doesn't want to study the sea animals dead the way everybody else is. She wants to study them live. And so in 1832, she begins investigating this marvelous creature called the paper nautilus. You see a picture of it here. And to observe it closely under controlled conditions, she creates the very first glass aquarium. And she publishes her research on the paper nautilus and her design for the aquarium, but male scientists try to take credit. She will have none of it. She has detailed, precise evidence, and it is slowly accepted, and she insists on her rights as an inventor as well, and she becomes the first woman named to professional societies, including the very prestigious Zoological Society of London. Jumping across the Atlantic now to our side, we have U.S. Science coming into its own, and a very notable astronomer by the name of Maria Mitchell. She had a Quaker education in Nantucket. Quakers believed that women and boys and girls should get the same education, and Nantucket was a whaling town, which meant the men were away for 10 or 12 months of the year, and the women basically did everything. In any event, her father was interested in astronomy because that was needed for navigation, and he got her hooked. She helps him with his calculations. And then on October 1st, 1847, she spotted a new comet. It became known as Miss Mitchell's Comet, became very famous. She becomes famous all over the world, and she travels and meets other scientists. And then the following year, she's the first woman elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And 17 years later, she becomes the first professor hired to teach at Vassar, a new women's college. 5 years after that, she discovers she's not making the same as her fellow male professors at that college. And so in 1871, she becomes a co-founder of the American Association for the Advancement of Women. During the 19th century, many women were fascinated with the stars and got involved and took training in astronomy, but they weren't allowed to observe through professional telescopes at night. It was considered improper. So they were forced to do their observations looking at the glass photographic plates that the male scientists, the male observers created. But women made astonishing discoveries via this technique, including Annie Jump Cannon, who got the nickname the census taker of the stars because she classified the spectra of, are you ready for this? Over 400,000 stars in her lifetime. It's a world record. And Henrietta Swan Leavitt, who recognized that the blink time could measure the true brightness of a star, and her star charts enabled astronomers to show the Milky Way stretched out further than thought, and it basically helped lead to the Big Bang, the understanding of the Big Bang. Well, as the 19th century drew to a close, we had people writing speculative fiction, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, with dreams of space flight, but the actual space flight still had to wait till we figured out how to get a powered airplane off the ground, which the Wright brothers managed to do in 1903. And then throughout the 20th century, men and women were able to not only observe the heavens, but start leaving the Earth. And Carol Simon Levin has another program called Nobody Owns the Sky about the early women involved. And another program called A Wasp Takes Wing, the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. And those were about the adventurous pioneering women who were serving their country. So this is where I come in, Jerrie Cobb, because I heard about the wasps when I was 12 or 13 years old, and it sounded wonderful because I had just discovered flying myself. I was born in 1931 in Oklahoma, but we moved around quite a lot during my childhood because my father was in the Army Reserves, eventually the Army Air Force Reserves. And I was literally tongue-tied growing up. Until I was 5, I had an extra membrane and I couldn't speak. And so quite shy, but I found my joy outdoors, especially horseback riding. And then when I was 12 years old, my father, who wanted to become a pilot in World War II, joined the Army Air Force pilots portion. He was told he was too old unless he was already a pilot, already had a license. So he went out determined to get one. And along the way, he bought a 1936 Waco airplane. And while he was getting his requisite flying hours, he started letting me sit in the second seat. And I found that exhilarating. And when he had to sell the airplane and we moved on, I was devastated, but everywhere we moved after that, you could find me anytime I could get there at the local airfield, trading lots of cleaning and repairing and anything else I could do for rides and impromptu lessons on planes, which resulted on my 17th birthday in my earning my pilot's license. And then shortly thereafter, after fixing up a little Piper J3 Cub airplane, 40 horsepower, I got a summer job flying solo around the Midwest, dropping the circus is coming flyers, spending every night sleeping under the wing in some farmer's field, and earning more fuel money by taking people out, up and away. All is which that is to say, by the end of the summer, I had over 500 hours easily over the 200 hours I needed on my 18th birthday to get my commercial license. And I soon earned a multi-engine, instrument, flight instructor, and ground instructor ratings and an airline transport license. But despite all these fancy papers, I basically couldn't get a job in aviation because there were so many male military pilots who had come home from the war. I got a few temporary jobs teaching flying. I had some kind of non-glamorous jobs, crop dusting and pipeline patrol, did a lot of airplane maintenance, and spent 3 summers doing semi-professional women's softball for the Oklahoma City Queens in order to get the money I needed to buy a World War II surplus airplane. All of which is to say that in 1952, when I was 21 years old and saw an advertisement for someone who was looking for people to be experienced pilots to be co-pilot DC-3 for no money, just experience, I jumped at the chance. I sent a telegram saying I was ready and eager and could I come, and they said yes. So I drove 1,800 miles to Miami, and then when I got there and they looked at me and they said, "You're the strangest looking Jerrie," in other words, not a man they had ever seen, and said no dice. After I didn't have the money for the fuel to go back to Oklahoma, so I ended up finding work, but I couldn't even find mechanics work. I had to be a clerk typist at the aircraft maintenance shop. But it would turn out that my ears perked up a few months later. We had somebody come in who was complaining about how long it was taking to get his airplane repaired, and it was about 6 in the morning, and he wanted somebody to get on it immediately, and we didn't open till 8, but somebody said, "Oh, Jerry's probably out there looking at airplanes," and I was, and I did the paperwork, and he got his airplane, and he was very happy. And while he was waiting for the airplane to be finished, he took me out for a cup of coffee, and he complained about the fact that he couldn't find pilots. He was Jack Ford, he was the president of Fleetway, and they were ferrying Army surplus airplanes to militaries all over the world, but he couldn't find anybody who wanted to fly single engine airplanes over the Caribbean. Obviously, if you have engine trouble, you go into the deep and nobody ever finds you. And I said, well, how about trying me? And he looked at me and he said, talk to me after you have 3,000 flying hours. And I pulled out my flight logs and I said, I have 3,500 right now. And he said, okay. And after about a 30-minute lesson on an airplane I had never flown before, the AT-6, I took off in one airplane, he took off in another, and we headed across the Caribbean. It was an interesting first flight, because when I got to Ecuador to refuel the airplane without him because he had lost some landing gear on one of our intermediate stops, I was arrested as a spy, because Ecuador and Peru, and my airplane was in Peruvian colors, I was headed to Peru. In between the time we'd gotten the clearance and the time that I had landed there, they'd gone to war, and they thought I was definitely suspicious. Fortunately, Washington finally managed to get me free, and I did get out of there. But within the year, I was heading his South American operations, and within a year after that, I was piloting a B-17 4-engine bomber, my very first time doing this through an ice storm to Paris. So there were quite a lot of adrenaline spiking moments in this job, but it was very exciting, and I was the only woman in the world doing this work. So it was quite a letdown when it ended in the mid-50s, and I sent hundreds of applications and really had a tough time finding a job. Finally got a job as an executive pilot at an Oklahoma-based aircraft designer, but it wasn't terribly exciting. So when my friend and newspaper reporter Ivy Coffey suggested that I think about breaking some world records to celebrate Oklahoma's 50th anniversary as a state, I was all for it. It took about a year to get all the necessary paperwork and permissions, but finally in May of 1957 I went up. I flew from Guatemala City to Oklahoma City and set a world record for nonstop long distance flying in a light aircraft. And then, and incidentally, flew through tornadoes, hail, and slashing rain, so that the follow-up plane that was having the reporters in it actually didn't follow me a lot of the way. But I broke the record held by a Russian Air Force officer, and in the middle of the Cold War, that was a pretty exciting thing to do. The following month, I went off to try to set the world altitude record for lightweight aircraft, and brought this airplane up over 30,000 feet. It was shaking, it was trembling, it was threatening to stall every moment, but I got it there, and I thought I'd set the record, but unfortunately the barograph malfunctioned, and I ended up having to do it a second time a few months later. In any event, after both of these, when I emerged from the aircraft, in the case of the altitude, I was going from 90 degrees at ground level to the negative numbers up in 30,000 feet. So I was wearing an Arctic suit, but I took off the Arctic suit, put on the high heels and lipstick before I emerged from the aircraft, because that was what was expected of women flyers. And then the reporters asked, what does a pretty young girl like you want to do, spending her time around the dirt and grime and noise of airplanes? But I couldn't stop. However, everything came to a head 3 months later, October 4th, 1957, when beep, 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 Sputnik started across the night sky. The Soviet Union had launched the first satellite, and the space race was on, and a month after that they sent the first animal, the dog Laika, into space. In December, the U.S. tried to send a satellite up, and it exploded on the launch pad. The press called it Kaputnik, Stayputnik, and Dudnik. Finally, on January 31st, 1958, the U.S. successfully launched Explorer 1, our first satellite. And that October, we officially launched NASA. NACA became NASA, and we were in the space race. And NASA publicly announced Project Mercury on December 17th, 1958, manned space orbit around Earth to make history. But who should be these first American astronauts? There was a real debate going on who would be the best for this. Mountain climbers used to high altitudes, acrobats, deep sea divers, meteorologists. But President Eisenhower and NASA decided that the military test pilots, jet test pilots, would be the best candidates because they already were used to dangerous work and they already had security clearance. And so NASA announced its requirements for astronauts. They needed to be college graduates in STEM, under 40 years old, under 5'11", because the Mercury capsule was so tiny, under 180 pounds, and a Navy or Air Force test pilot school graduate with at least 1,500 hours of flight time. The only problem with that is that the Navy and the Air Force didn't take women. Therefore, there would be no women candidates. 32 jet test pilots did volunteer for this most dangerous, important, dangerous mission. They went through months of medical and stress testing, and 7 passed. And on April 9th, 1959, at a press conference, the Mercury 7 were debuted to an adoring press, and NASA said the correct men had been chosen. And here you can see the Mercury 7. Something that's funny in this illustration is that the 2 gentlemen in the front middle are wearing spray-painted work boots because NASA hadn't made the proper boots, the astronaut boots, yet. But here you've got 7 handsome, white male military test pilots, the brave men who would take America into space. But some in the Air Force and NASA were wondering, were they the right stuff? Were they the best candidates? Including Dr. William Randolph, known as Randy Lovelace II, who was the head of medical testing for NASA, and Brigadier General Donald Flickinger, known as General Flick. And he was the head of the Air Force program. They weren't so sure because many engineers were speculating that women would actually make better astronauts. They were smaller, lighter, consume less food and oxygen, so they'd require less fuel to propel them into space. And there was some testing that suggested that women were better under stress as well. So in the fall of 1959, General Flick proposed that the Air Force start research in what he called Project WISE, Women in Space Earliest. And he wanted to work with Dr. Lovelace to test female candidates to compare their testing results to male astronauts. And this is where I connect with them. In that same September, there was an Air Force Association meeting on Miami Beach, and I was walking there with my boss at Aero Design, Tom Harris, when we saw 2 men emerge from the surf, dripping wet, and Tom knew them and made introductions, and it turned out, of course, it was Dr. Lovelace and General Flick. And they had just returned from a conference in Moscow where they had heard that Russians were considering women in space. And I mentioned something in our conversation about Russian pilots, and they asked if I was a pilot, and I answered yes. And then my boss added that I had 16 years as a commercial pilot, my over 7,000 flying hours, and my altitude and speed records, and that I'd gotten several other honors, including just being named the 1959 Women of the Year in Aviation. And after 2 days of discussions at this conference, they asked the key question, would I be willing to be a test subject for the first research on women as astronauts? And my response was, of course, absolutely. So that fall, while waiting to be called for testing, I had the opportunity to break the sound barrier piloting a Delta Dagger jet for 40 minutes, which I found very easy after everything else I'd done, effortless, I called it, and very exciting because I knew that all the astronauts were jet pilots, so now I was one. Then on December 7th, 1959, I received a letter from General Flick telling me that the Air Force had withdrawn support for Project WISE. I would later learn that this had happened because they'd invited Ruth Nichols, who was an award-winning pilot, a 58-year-old award-winning pilot, to go through some of the tests, and wrote on some training devices, isolation tests that the men had done, and she did well, and then wrote publicly about her experiences, saying that women were naturals. Well, this apparently infuriated the Air Force, and they canceled Project WISE in November. So General Flick had to pull out, but he still was curious, and he encouraged Dr. Lovelace to continue the medical testing portion at his clinic. NASA was really interesting during this time in giving multiple and confusing signals, because at the same time that the Air Force was refusing to finance WISE, NASA authorized Look magazine to do an article on this Betty Skelton, this photogenic aerobatics pilot and race car driver, and she went and did many of the same physical testing as the Mercury 7 and operated a NASA simulator. And then the article said that basically the male pilots thought she was terrific and nicknamed her astronaut 7.5. Didn't report on her actual results, but it was fairly encouraging, although probably just a PR thing. In any event, I received instructions to travel to the Lovelace Clinic on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1960. Now, I had to do it in secret, and I told my colleagues I was visiting family, and though I was going on Valentine's Day, I knew this was not going to be hearts and Valentines. The press from the Mercury 7 the press conferences had made it pretty clear this was going to be brutal. So I steeled myself for the trial of a lifetime, and I felt a lot was riding on my shoulders. If I did well, it would encourage NASA to consider other women. If I failed, it probably would be the death knell. And the tests were exhausting and brutal. It was exactly the same testing as the men, except that I also had gynecological tests. Basically, they put tubes into every orifice in our bodies. Over 100 x-rays. No one knew what zero gravity would do to the human body, so Dr. Lovelace was testing everything. There was a tilt table that tested our cardiovascular circulation. Many people would pass out, but from all my experience, I wasn't even dizzy. I was not claustrophobic, even in a coffin-like space. Over 8 hours a day for 75 tests over 8 days. Everything tested. I think one of the most excruciating was that they injected 10-degree water in my ear, which created vertigo, and it was very painful. And then they did it in the other ear. With the first one, you didn't know it was coming. The second, you did. I also had what I dubbed the bicycle ride from hell to space. They put an 80-pound sandbag on the back wheel, and I was instructed. There was a metronome, and I had to pedal as fast as I could, and I got up to 100 beats per minute, my heart rate, until they told me to stop. And I was flown to a secret government location in Los Alamos, slid inside a machine that measured the radiation in my body. And apparently I passed, because Dr. Lovelace told me he was quite pleased, but told me to keep my results secret. So I did until August 19th, 1960, when Dr. Lovelace was attending an international space medicine conference in Sweden, and announced that I had passed the same physiological and medical exams the Mercury 7 astronauts had, and said, "We are already in a position to say that certain qualities of the female space pilot are preferable to those of her male colleagues." Well, my phone and every friend and family member's phone rang off the hook. 4 days later, back in the United States in New York, Dr. Lovelace called a press conference. I was there, and the reporters couldn't get enough of this astronautics, as they called me. And they asked everything and reported everything, including my height, my weight, and my measurements. A media frenzy. AP took the story across the country, and you can see 20 years a pilot wants to be an astronaut. Moon maid's ready. #1 space gal seems a little astronauty. And then the Los Angeles Times. The scientists haven't even figured out how to get a man to the moon yet, but they've opened the trip to women. That shows how far the craftier sex has come. Time magazine had a much more serious story. It reported on my training, my vacation so-called vacation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and how Dr. Lovelace had said that I qualified to live, observe, and do optimal work in the environment of space. The first lady astronauts, not astronaut tricks, as they called me, and they reported that I was calm as hell in a plane, the best organized girl pilot I've ever seen, and the most feminine. And I said I had no qualms about being a scientific guinea pig, and I was looking forward to months of arduous training. And if all goes well, perhaps in late 1962, Jerrie Cobb will don a formless pressure suit, tuck her ponytail into a helmet, and hop atop a rocket for the long, lonely trip into space. Life magazine did a photo essay on it, and I also was in Sports Illustrated and other publications. I got some sponsorship offers, but refused them and instead literally dived into the second round of testing, which was a sensory deprivation tank at the VA in Oklahoma. I stayed for 9 hours and 40 minutes, felt totally fine in there. Interestingly enough, the male astronauts had gotten really had problems after about 3 hours in a dark room. I also took psychological exams and was told that I had done better than the Mercury men, who'd become irritated at all the questions they were being asked. I also wanted to get a chance to ride the MASIF, which is this multiple axis space test inertia facility. This was a machine that rotated on 3 different axes, and I got permission from NASA, and I rode it. And I was told that Alan Shepard had lost his lunch, but I stayed on for 45 minutes and had a ball. It really was fun. Dr. Lovelace wanted to prove, though, that my results weren't a fluke, so he asked me to go through the records of all the other women professional pilots in the country, searching for other candidates. And we were looking for healthy, accomplished, and determined women, and we eventually would find 24. We sent invitations on Lovelace Foundation letterhead asking, will you volunteer for the initial examinations for women astronaut candidate? 18 accepted. They ranged from a 21-year-old flight instructor, Wally Funk, to 39-year-old Janie Hart, who was the mother of 8 and the wife of Senator Philip Hart. And she took 3 grocery carts of groceries to prepare her family before she left, and some of his constituents weren't at all happy with her doing this. Some candidates did it in secret. Others were more public. In the case of the Dietrich twins, they were on the cover of the Parade magazine. Some publications weren't so happy, however. While the other candidates were doing their initial phase with Dr. Lovelace, I did my final phase of testing. Dr. Lovelace had informally arranged for me to go to the U.S. Naval School of Aviation in Pensacola, Florida, to do 10 days of spaceflight simulation testing, exactly the same testing as the Navy pilots, and no allowance for my size. And I scored fine, as did 12 of the 18 women who attempted the Dr. Lovelace's tests. Jerry Sloan speaks to the determination. We never stopped until they told us to stop. We didn't even say ouch, and boy, they hurt us. You want an astronaut? By God, I'll give you one. So on May 17, 1961, Dr. Lovelace sent congratulations letters to each of the candidates, telling them to prepare mentally and physically for the next stages at the naval base in Pensacola, and also telling them that Jackie Cochran, the famous aviator, would fund the travel costs for any women who couldn't afford it. But meanwhile, on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin from the USSR got into space first, the first manned space flight. Less than a week later, the U.S. had its failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs. In May 5th, Alan Shepard finally made a suborbital flight, but it was clear that we were second best, that we were not, that the USSR was winning. That month, I wrote to the head of NASA, James Webb, saying that I'd heard that the Soviets were getting ready to send a woman into space, and that I was fully prepared to go. We could actually beat them. But President Kennedy and NASA had a different idea. They wanted to level the playing field by throwing the target much further out, setting the moon as a new goal in space before the end of the decade. And on May 25th, 1969, before a joint session of Congress, President Kennedy promised America that they would do that. The very next day, ironically right in Oklahoma, my home state, NASA held the first national conference on the peaceful uses of space. I was there. Dr. Lovelace was there. He announced that a number of women had passed the first round of testing. And at the banquet, I was seated next to James Webb, who was the guest speaker, and I discussed with him the letter I'd written about female astronauts. he jotted something on the napkin, and then when he got up to the podium, he made the announcement that I would be special NASA consultant in named manned spaceflight. Totally out of the blue. I had no idea this was coming. It was surprising. I was pleased. He called me. He said I'd be a great asset to the program. It was wonderful. And there I go with a big A-OK smile on my face. So the first thing I did as their new consultant was send NASA a proposal, making a formal request that NASA beat the Soviets with women in space. And I sent letters addressed to the fellow trainees. I called them the fellow lady astronaut trainee. So we had the nickname Flats, congratulating them and talking about our upcoming testing in Pensacola. It was very exciting because it was the first time most of us would meet each other. We'd been tested in 1s and 2s. But meanwhile, there was no answer from NASA, and then a note from Dr. Lovelace saying that the testing had been postponed until September. And with no answer and all this going on, I quipped that I felt like the least consulted consultant in history. Worried about the loss of momentum, I invited some of the candidates to do their isolation simulation testing in Oklahoma and stay in at my house while they were doing it. I made a space-themed bedroom, and 2 of the candidates, Rhea Hurl and Wally Funk, took me up on the offer, and that was very exciting. And both of them bested my record and did phenomenally well. But then we learned that the testing was terminated. On September 12, 1961, every flat received this telegram: regret to advise, arrangements at Pensacola canceled. Probably will not be possible to carry out this part of the program. You may return the funds you've advanced and so forth. It happened literally as the flats were leaving their homes, with just a day or so before the testing. And we were stunned, frustrated, heartbroken. Many people had gone through the brutal testing, of course, and also made a lot of sacrifices, including several women who'd given up their jobs to have this opportunity because their bosses wouldn't give them the time off. I wrote to NASA trying to find out why. Again, dead silence. And in December, James Webb quietly rescinded my never paid NASA consultancy. Ironically, the very same month that the Girl Scouts magazine, American Girl, published an article entitled "Lots of Room and Space for Women," with encouraging words from President Kennedy: "The skills and imagination of our young men and women are not only welcome but urgently sought in this vital area." Well, February of 1962, NASA sponsored the first Women's Space Symposium. It was a highly publicized event. I spoke, and it led to many young women, including the future Hillary Rodham Clinton, to write to NASA asking how they could become astronauts, to which NASA replied it had no programs for women and did not plan to start any. Well, we took our case to the White House. In March, Janie Hart used her Washington contacts to get us an appointment with the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, who was also the head of the National Aeronautical Space Council, asking that he ask NASA to reconsider their decision. His aide, Liz Carpenter, was on our side and drafted a letter to this effect. And he was very polite when he met us, but apparently right after we walked out the door, he wrote in big letters, "Let's stop this now, file," on the bottom of the letter, and it was filed for 40 years and nobody knew about it. Meanwhile, Janie and I took our campaign to the press and to Congress. We stated we seek only a place in our nation's space future without discrimination. And again, due to Janie's contacts, we got a House Space Subcommittee hearing in July. And we were the first 2 speakers, the first day of hearings. And we made the arguments you've heard already about women's physiological and psychological advantages in fuel economy, the race with the Soviet Union, and that NASA could be first. But then Jackie Cochran arrived. She was a famous aviator and had been the head of the WASPs in World War II, an old friend of Dr. Lovelace, and as you knew, she had offered funding. But she became angry when Dr. Lovelace refused to allow her to be tested, because he said she was too old and she had too many medical issues. And even angrier, when not allowed to test, she was also Dr. Lovelace refused to put her in charge of the FLATS program. And so when she took to the floor, she said, "There's no need to rush a woman in space. For now, space is a man's game. FLATS should be patient and let NASA focus on the moon." She would later be rewarded as being another consultant to NASA. And then, to add insult to injury, on the second day, John Glenn and Scott Carpenter, who had just gone into space and were national heroes, spoke out and said that NASA was right to insist that jet pilots, military jet pilots, be a requirement. The men go off and fight the wars and fly the airplanes and come back and help design and build and test them. The fact that women are not in this field is a fact of our social order. And really, the fact was that most politicians wanted a triumph in space with 7 rugged astronaut heroes leading the way, and women, no matter how able, didn't fit their picture. Case closed. But it wasn't for us. We kept going. We sent telegrams to the president requesting an appointment. "Nope," said James Webb. I gave interviews, TV appearances, talks to women's groups across the country, magazine articles, pointed out that the U.S. was perfectly willing to send up a female chimp, but not a female. We had women protesting all across the country, but NASA was unmoved. In March of 1963, I sent another letter to the president. And in June of 1963, my publisher sent my autobiography, a final plea for women to be astronauts. But though we received a polite acknowledgement from the president's secretary, it was too late. The FLATS were, in what NASA would say, NASA lingo, OBE, overtaken by events. The Soviets had sent up a woman. On June 17, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. They had trained 5 women, and including one who was a pilot and engineer that the trainers had preferred, but the Soviet authorities had chosen Valentina Tereshkova because she was a factory worker, a member of the proletariat. She was also a very experienced parachute jumper, which was important because the Soviet program landed their capsules by parachute. Anyway, she solos in orbit for almost 3 days and is a national hero. And they timed it perfectly because there was a worldwide conference on the status of women held in Moscow. And so she lands and immediately marches in a parade the following day at this event to show in Moscow, showing the world how female forward they are. They're so female forward it'll be another 20 years before they have another one. It's all PR. And she also is blamed for a problem that occurs on the mission, but it turns out it was an engineer's fault, but the world didn't find out for that for years. In any event, we're through. 3 years later, in 1966, the National Organization for Women was founded, and Janie Hart was one of the founding members, along with Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique. And among NOW's first actions was to force newspapers to eliminate sex-segregated help-wanted ads and filing a formal complaint against NASA about sex discrimination. But that, of course, would be too late for us. The same year, in September, Star Trek premiered and showed Uhura, a black female astronaut, but she also wouldn't be represented for several decades. However, though NASA refused to consider women as astronauts, behind the scenes, NASA was depending on Hidden Figures. You may know the film or the book. Both black and white women who were essential to the space program. And their first woman was actually hired in September of 1939. Her name was Kitty Joyner. She had become an engineer at University of Virginia after having to sue to gain admission there, and worked her entire career at NACA/NASA after it was renamed. Mary Golda Ross becomes the first Native American aerospace engineer, one of many who come in during World War II. She was actually from the Cherokee, and she's hired as a mathematician at Lockheed during World War II, works on the P-38 Lightning airplane, and then in the 1950s she's Lockheed's first woman engineer, the only woman among 40 engineers in Lockheed's top secret Skunk Works group, which worked on top secret aviation space programs. She couldn't tell people what she did exactly, but apparently she did tell people generally, because in 1958 she appeared on the national TV program What's My Line. Her job was designs rocket, missiles, and satellites. Mary Sherman Morgan was indeed America's first female rocket scientist. She left college during World War II without finishing her chemistry degree, but apparently it didn't slow her down. She took a top secret position designing ordnance and explosives, and then after the war she was the only woman among 900 engineers at North American Aviation's Rocketdyne division. And when they were asked by NASA for the best man to head their team to develop a powerful rocket fuel, they said their best man was a woman, Mary, and she was named the technical lead, and they created Hydene, which propelled the Jupiter rocket and America's first successful satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. Dr. Nancy Grace Roman discovered her love of the stars walking at night with her mother, but her school was definitely not encouraging. Her high school counselor said, what kind of a lady would take mathematics instead of Latin? But she pursued. In 1949 she got her PhD in astronomy, and in 1959 she was named head of observational astronomy at NASA, the first woman to hold an executive position there, and she would be instrumental in spearheading the Hubble Space Telescope program. And now, of course, I think you probably all met Dorothy Vaughan in Hidden Figures. She was first hired and then named head of the West Area Computing Unit, the black female unit, doing trajectory and other mathematics for NACA during the war, and then was brought over to NASA. They were segregated at NACA, but when they went to NASA in 1958, they finally desegregated the unit. Her work and the work of her girls were essential, including Mary Jackson. She's one of the human computers, as they were called, who became NASA's first black female aeronautical engineer. Got a job with the West Area Computing Section, asked a lot of questions. One of the engineers noticed her bright mind and encouraged her to get an engineering degree. She had a hard time doing that because of the segregated facilities, but again pursued and managed it, and she becomes, in 1958, as I said, NASA's first black female aeronautical engineer, and NASA's headquarters in Washington are now named after her. And last of these group, but definitely not least, Katherine Johnson, a brilliant mathematician. Again, you may have seen her in that film. She was, again, a human computer. She started attending the engineers' meetings and got a reputation for flawless analysis, so much so that when John Glenn was ready to go up on Project Mercury, he refused to go up until the computer calculations were checked and verified by Katherine Johnson, and her calculations were required and essential for the Apollo 11 program as well. Well, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon, says, "One small step for man, one giant step for mankind." But he wouldn't have gotten there without other womenkind, including Dottie Lee, who was the aerospace engineer who designed the heat shield that was used both on Mercury, both on Apollo and on the space shuttles. In fact, it got the nickname Dottie's Nose, and she was so essential to the program that when she retired, it was said they needed 10 other people to replace her. Joanne Morgan was the only woman in the launch firing room for the liftoff of Apollo 11. You can see her right there with the red arrow. She had, while earning her bachelor's in mathematics, was working at Cape Canaveral as an engineer's aide when Dr. Werner von Braun, I don't know how to count up, I only count down, it's not my department, says Werner von Braun. He's so impressed that he urges her to become an engineer, and in 1963 she's hired as NASA's first female engineer at Kennedy Space Center. Significant obstacles, including receiving obscene phone calls at her station and also having to have a security guard clear the only bathroom, which is male, before she goes to use it. But she persisted and spent 45 years at NASA, eventually becoming the first female senior executive at Kennedy. Poppy Northcutt was the only woman in mission control for Apollo 8. She was hired by a computress, hired as a computress in 1965, and she and her team designed the return to Earth trajectory for Apollo 8. And later, she and other engineers quickly, modified the computer program for Apollo 13 after an oxygen tank exploded and they had to get down quickly, and they were later awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom team for that work. We have Judy Sullivan, who joined NASA in 1966, and she was the lead engineer for the biomedical system for Apollo 11. And by that time, she's one of 100 women, including 16 engineers, serving in top positions there. And little but big, Margaret Hamilton, an MIT computer scientist who headed the team that developed the onboard flight software for NASA's Apollo program. And that big, tall pile, that is the program that they wrote. It's taller than she is. And her forward thinking saved the 1969 Apollo 11 mission when one of the astronauts accidentally triggered an unnecessary radar system, which aborted some of the software. So she fixed that very quickly. Before I leave the software that was on Apollo 11, I just wanted to make a quick nod to the women who are called the Waltham Little Old Ladies. The Apollo Guidance System computer didn't use disks because they couldn't handle the vibrations and g-forces of launch. So instead, they had rope memory, literally hardwired memory. And that was hardwired by women in Waltham, Massachusetts. It was exacting, painstaking work of threading a wire in and around metal disks to make the zeros and ones of a computer program. In fact, it was nearly 600,000 disks and wires had to be positioned exactly correctly. If any had been wrong, the program might have failed at a critical point. They were so essential, they were sometimes paid even if they were not needed on a particular day, so they'd be ready and available when they were. And that program actually saved Apollo 12 when it was hit off on liftoff. Other women, just a quick nod to, Playtex got the contract to make the spacesuits, and they were handmade, hand-sewed, detailed, precise work. Ditto and Playtex got it because they said they had the experience with bras and girdles with garments that had to be both form-fitting and flexible, like the spacesuits. Women also did the sewing, the exacting critical sewing on the parachutes. Meanwhile, outside of NASA, women who couldn't go into space were making exciting new discoveries, including Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who discovered pulsars, a whole new kind of star, and Vera Rubin, who was rejected when she wanted to go to Princeton. They wouldn't take women, but got her PhD at Cornell, and then did work on rotation of galaxies, which provided the evidence for the existence of dark matter. And many of her fellow colleagues have argued she should have won the Nobel Prize for that work. Now, jumping from space down below for a few minutes, while ships have always been named after women, for a very long time there was a superstition that women shouldn't go on ships, that it would bring them bad luck. But there was a woman who wasn't allowed on a ship who revolutionized our understanding of the ocean floor. Her name was Marie Sharp, and she was fascinated by just about everything in college, but particularly geology. Goes to Columbia University, but as I said, not allowed to go on a ship, but ends up translating the soundings, the records that people who did go out on ships did for the depth of the ocean floor, into hand-drawn maps of the entire world's oceans, the first comprehensive map. And she detected a deep rift on the ocean floor where earthquakes occurred, and that led to the understanding of continental drift and shaped the way we think of Earth. Eugenia Clark shaped the way we think of one of the most intelligent animals in the ocean, changing our attitudes towards sharks, these misunderstood creatures, and urging us to care for our oceans. Well, in 1972, the Space Shuttle program was announced. Up to 7 people would be going up on each flight, and they wouldn't just need pilots, but also scientists. And this is the same year that the Equal Rights Amendment passed overwhelmingly, both houses in Congress, over 80% in each, bipartisan. Within a year, 30 states had ratified. It looked like a good go, and then Phyllis Schlafly got in the action, and it slowed and then halted. 50 years later, the Equal Rights are part of the constitutions of 168 countries, but not the U.S. That same year, Congress passed an amendment to the 1964 Civil Rights Act saying that any agency that got money from the U.S. government could no longer discriminate on sex, race, religion, or national origin. So NASA could no longer refuse to accept women astronauts. Well, at the 1975 Star Trek convention, Nichelle Nichols, the woman who played Uhura, heard NASA Director of Sciences speak, and then she made a speech at that National Space Conference urging that they diversify. And apparently NASA listened because they put her in charge of being a publicist and advocate for encouraging women and minorities to apply to the space program. And in 1977, NASA announced openings for new pilots and mission specialists, the first in 9 years. And the following year's class, also known as the 35 New Guys, had the first African American, the first Asian American, and the first women, 6 in all. And here you probably recognize some of them. And they got to do all the things we had wanted to do. They had a year's training, learning how everything on the shuttle worked. They had water and land survival, simulated weightlessness in the vomit comet, as it was called, advanced training in navigation controls in their mission simulator. We were pretty jealous of that, as you might imagine. But before any of them went into space, the Soviets did it again. This time on August 19, 1982, they sent the second woman in space, Svetlana Savitskaya. She was the first woman pilot in space, and 2 years later, she'd be the first female spacewalker. Finally, though, on June 18, 1983, America put its first woman in space. Ride, Sally, ride. We have liftoff. She'd been the capsule communicator for the first 2 shuttle missions, and she was assigned flight engineer for the 7th flight. She was chosen because of her expertise in the robotic arm, and she'd fly a second mission 1 year later, and then later on would tragically have to serve on teams investigating the Challenger and Columbia disasters. She became a lifelong advocate for girls in STEM and said young girls need to see role models just so they can picture themselves doing those jobs someday. You can't be what you can't see. She also pointed out some of the ridiculous things NASA did, including that the engineers at NASA insisted in their infinite wisdom of sending up a makeup kit with women astronauts, and also 100 tampons for a 1-week flight for one female astronauts. They were really clueless. Anyway, she's soon followed by other female NASA astronauts, including Catherine Sullivan, who becomes the first American woman to walk in space. She was a trained oceanographer, and she was on the 41G Challenger, the first with 2 women aboard. She was there with Sally Ride. Shannon Lucen becomes the first mother to be selected as an astronaut candidate and the first American woman to fly and to work on a space station. That was Mir. And she conducted 5 shuttle missions in all over 11 years, spending 179 days in space in 1996. Till 2007, she had the record for the most days in orbit. Then we had Krista McAuliffe, the New Hampshire social studies teacher who tragically died on the Challenger explosion. And Mae Jemison, the first African American woman in space. She was fascinated when she got a splinter and pus in her finger as a child. Wanted to be a doctor, but the teacher said no, maybe a nurse. But her mother encouraged her, and she ends up seeing Apollo when she's growing up. And at age 16, she got her engineering degree, and in 1981, she got her Doctor of Medicine, and then went in the Peace Corps and did some work in Africa. But then in 1987, she was selected as an astronaut by NASA, the only black woman out of 2,000 applications, only the 15 selected. And in 1992, she flew on the Space Shuttle Endeavour, doing 44 science experiments. After that, she ends up leaving NASA to start a foundation that promotes STEM and urging a vision that we will have human travel to another star within 100 years. And she started each shift with a shout out to Uhura. Then we have Kalpana Chawla. She's the first astronaut of Indian descent. Born in India, she comes to the U.S. to get 2 masters and a Ph.D. She becomes a researcher at NASA, focusing on vertical takeoff and landing, which is what is used now by SpaceX and Blue Origin, the private space companies. And in 1994, she became an astronaut candidate, and she flew 2 missions on the Space Shuttle Columbia. Tragically, on the second one, she was killed. And Ellen Ochoa, the first Latina astronaut, who got her PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford, and then 3 optical inspection system patents, which were used when she was at NASA. And then on April 4th, 1993, she became mission specialist aboard Discovery, and then she would do 3 more missions as well. After retiring as an astronaut, she became director of the Johnson Space Center, which was, of course, unheard of in the good old boys' days. And now we get to Eileen Collins, the first U.S. astronaut pilot. She had a tough childhood, but she dreamed becoming a pilot, a military pilot, and did. She became an Air Force pilot and instructor, and then was selected as an astronaut candidate by NASA. And in 1995, she was the first woman to pilot the space shuttle on a rendezvous between Discovery and Mir. And in 1999, she'd be the first female commander of a U.S. spacecraft. And in 2005, she commanded the first space shuttle to return to orbit after Columbia. And she insisted that we, the surviving flat women, be invited to her first launch, and again in 1999. And she said that if it weren't for the Mercury 13, as we were called by then, she would not be there today. And NASA dedicated that launch to us. Peggy Whitson becomes the first female International Space Station commander, and she is our most experienced American astronaut. She has a record for total spacewalks, 10 by women, and she's been the oldest woman in space at age 57, and has to date spent over 665 days in space, and is planning to go up again next year to be mission commander of Axiom Mission 2, if that does go up, on a private crew mission to ISS. With Russia, we don't know anything anymore. Meanwhile, Christina Koch set a record for the longest single stay in space by any woman, and she was joined by her fellow astronaut Jessica Meir on first all-female spacewalk. And Holly Ridings became the first female chief flight director, and is still overseeing human spaceflight missions to the ISS, Mars, and partnerships between NASA and private commercials aircrafts. So, quick return to my story. After 3 futile years fighting for the flats, I was fed up with people. I was very religious, and I wanted to do something with my life. And so I spoke to missionary organizations about flying missionary flights in the Amazon, and none of the organizations would take me. So I ended up flying for a couple of years to earn enough money to buy my own airplane and fund my own missionary flights. And then I went to the Amazon and started delivering food, seeds, and medical supplies to the indigenous peoples there. And in 1972, I was honored with the 88 Tricks Trophy for my work there. For flying solo in her Aero Commander, she pioneered new air routes across the hazardous Andes Mountains and Amazon rainforests. And in 1981, I would be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. In between Eileen Collins' 2 flights, NASA decided to see what it would be like to launch an old person into space. And I heard that they were planning to launch John Glenn. So I wrote and said, how about an older woman? Well, I went to NASA, I pleaded my case, I spoke to the Associated Press. I said I'd give my life to fly in space. It wouldn't matter if I wouldn't come back. But NASA was unmoved despite the the National Organization for Women launching a nationwide campaign on my behalf. And I never flew to space. I died in 2019 after over 40 years of flying in the Amazon. So, but though I didn't get to fly into space, another one of the flats did, and that was Wally Funk. On July 20th, 2020, she, the youngest of the Mercury 13, now age 82, flew on the Blue Origin, circling the Earth for 11 minutes. As of December 2021, 596 people have flown in space. 72 have been women. NASA just announced the latest astronaut group. In this group, 5 are women and 7 are men. And maybe one of them will be the first female moonwalker. Or maybe Mars. As for me, I was listening to the radio on July 20th, 1969, when I heard that men were walking on the moon. And I would later write, yes, I wish I were on the moon with my fellow pilots exploring another celestial body. How I would love to see our beautiful blue planet Earth floating in the blackness of space and see the stars and galaxies in their true brilliance without the filter of our atmosphere. But I'm happy flying here in Amazonas, serving my brethren. Contenta, Senor, contenta. So now that we've explored the space, it's time to return to the planet we call home. And I just want to end the program with words from the amazing Sylvia Earle, who's been a marine biologist now for, I think, 5-6 decades, and is helping us to understand just how precious our Earth is, and particularly our oceans. She's called her deepness, and here you can hear her own words.
Two words of instruction: breathe naturally, and over the side I went. It took a few seconds, no more, before I felt like I belonged there. 4 decades ago, I had a chance to do some research.
There is a new tool in the sea. It can withstand water pressure to 2,000 feet. Dr. Sylvia Earle is a marine biologist. Her question: can scientists use the gym suit for dives beyond 1,000 feet? If successful, she will be the first woman to walk the seafloor beyond 1,000 feet.
We cooked up this idea of going on the nose of the submarine, like the ornament on the hood of a car, together down to the bottom of the ocean, and then I would step off at the maximum depth we could go, which turned out to be about 400 meters, 1,250 feet. Creatures with lights down the side. They look like little ocean liners. There are various kinds of jellies and crustaceans and little squids and the fish. It's like diving into a galaxy of these lights. What's hard is getting people to understand why the ocean matters to them. If the ocean dried up tomorrow, life would also dry up. That's where most of the action on Earth is. It's 97% of the water on Earth. They should know that with every breath they take, every drop of water they drink, the ocean is touching them. You should treat the ocean as if your life depends on it, because it does. My name is Sylvia Earle, and this is my brief but spectacular take on why the ocean matters to all of us. Marine bio.
And finally, the words of the very wise George Bernard Shaw. Now that we've learned to fly in the air like birds and dive in the sea like fish, only one thing remains: to learn to live on Earth like humans. So I want to thank you for having me here today, and encourage you, if I tickled your interest in any way, shape, or form, to go to your local library and seek out more information. There's some terrific collective and individual biographies on women in space and on the Mercury 13. And if you have Netflix, there's a documentary on the Mercury 13, which is quite good. And there's an off-Broadway play. It's not there right now, but maybe local theater might do it, called They Promised Her the Moon, which is quite marvelous. And I have 9 other programs, and I hope that you will either come to my website and see where I am next doing some of these programs, or that I get invited back to do a program where you are. So thank you so very much, and I will stop my share. Oh, just mention that it's at tellingherstories.com if you want to find any more about this. And now I thank you very much, and I can answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Carol. Eloise is wondering if there is a list anywhere of all of the book titles that you featured in this presentation. You have quite a lovely collection of, I think, children's books too, as well as adult books.
Yeah, in fact, I often start with children's books. Somebody is asking where I find out about these, and I often start with children's books because I get an introduction to things, and then I'll go deeper as needed. But it's a way of, I have a friend named Judy Freeman, who is a children's librarian's librarian. She does a program called Winners, the best children's books, and she quips that everything she ever learned, she learned from a children's book, and there's some truth there. You know, they cover things not in the same level of depth, and sometimes you have to go deeper, but in writing a children's book, somebody has to find out sort of the core, the essence, the most important things. So it's a great way, without reading 400 pages, to find the core and the essence, and then if you get curious and you need to find some background, you go further. And same with youth and teen, children's and teen collective biographies and adult collective biographies, where they're looking for the essence of people. So that is the children's part. Was that was one half of the question? Was there a second half of the question?
We do have a question from a patron who works with middle schoolers and is wondering how you discover some of the lesser known people throughout history that you portray and talk about. Their middle schoolers want to do a National History Day project.
Right.
They want to work with primary sources, but they're not sure how to go about finding these sources and these people who, we don't hear about often, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, I often try to choose somebody who's left me an autobiography. I have 2 rules for who my character will be. One is they have to be dead, because I don't think it's fair to portray somebody who's still talk for themselves. And the other, that is hopefully they have left me something in their voice. And so it may not be complete. I may have to go find a lot of, obviously an autobiography is what you've chosen to share with the world, and at whatever point you've chosen to do it. But it is a launching off point, so I can sort of get into the head of that character. In the question of how to find a good person to do, because you are dealing with primary sources for the National History Day, I think at this point there are a couple of options. One, you can see if any of your local history societies have any kind of letters or other primary documents. In many cases, people donate things, and nobody's had a chance to go through them if they're not a famous person. And then the other thing is there are institutions like the Schlesinger Library, which is out of Cambridge, which is sort of this national archive of women's history, and they have a lot of stuff they've digitized. So you could call up. I've always found librarians are wonderful people.
Thank you.
You, Kim. And if you telephone a library, here I'm looking at this. This is something I'm interested in. Do you know of somebody who has some interesting papers that I might take a look through? That's a great way to explore a possibility. I know that when I was a student at Cornell, I was hired by somebody to transcribe and go through. This is long before digital photography or anything else. I'm old. But somebody had an ancestor who had written letters, had been a woman from the North who'd worked as a teacher, a tutor for a governess for a family in the South just before the Civil War, and had written and the letters were were in the Cornell archives, and nobody had ever done anything with it. And this family wanted to have more information about the letters, so they hired me on a per hour basis for a semester. I was sending them notes and finding the highlights of the letters and such, which were interesting because paper was so expensive in those days that she would write one direction and then rotate 90 degrees and then write across it. So some of it was really challenging to read, but fascinating, and getting a bird's eye, getting a on the ground view of what was happening just in the years right before the Civil War from somebody who had the perspective of a Northerner, but working in the South. So that was fun. So you come across all sorts of interesting things, and she's not a famous person or anything like that, but she has a lot to contribute. You learn so much from everyday lives as well.
I think this is a question that's similar. Nancy is wondering where you found photographs of the exams that Jerrie Cobb underwent and the other female candidates.
Some of them I got from that Life magazine article, and it turned out that the photographs for the Life magazine articles were online. When I went looking for that article, I actually came across the original photos. So that is where a lot of them came from. And I also was able to use some of the photos that were in the books on them. That's where I think I got the picture. You make discoveries, like the picture of the American Girl magazine with lots of room for girls in space. That happened to be in there. And because this is considered face-to-face teaching exemption when you're doing something like this, I can show them on a slide without having to worry about copyright issues.
That's good to know.
I can take that picture and share that picture with you.
Yeah. Steve is wondering, when did Jerrie Cobb die? Wasn't that
2019?
Yeah, that was pretty recent.
Really recently, yeah. You go to my website, and do you see how Mother's Invention, this is the previous one, has a hot link thing? That takes you to a bibliography of Mothers of Invention. So I just started, this was just a week ago, I will put a bibliography of some of my favorite books on this subject, and it'll be available as right up here. You'll probably tomorrow or the next day I'll get that to you. But I'll just put Women of the Seas and the Stars. It'll be hot linked, and when you click on it, it will take you to a bibliography for that one, the way this one does. Oh, there's the bibliography, sorry. But you can see these are my slides for that, telling you where things are, and then I copy out of the slides the hot links, and then I put various biographies, other things. So I'll make something up like that before the end of the week, I hope, for this presentation. So just go to tellingherstories.com, Eloise, in a couple of days, and it'll be there.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Carol. This is your second time with us, and certainly not your last. We'll be in touch in the future.
Well, that'll be lovely. I love doing it. And
and everyone else, thank you so much for tuning in. As usual, if you want to keep up to date with our programs, you can visit us at penningtonlibrary.org. I know some of you are on our mailing list. Feel free to add your email to the survey you fill out that will be sent to you tomorrow in order to be added to our mailing list if you haven't been already. All right, have a lovely evening, everyone.
And thank you, Kim, for inviting me. This is, always a huge pleasure.
Well, take care, everyone. Until the next time, via Zoom. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.